Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Oh, I'm excited because we're at the Stoa and Forrest Landry, sense maker in residence for the month of December. We have Jordan Hall, David Fuller, sense makers as well. And what this series is, it's over a month, 4 weeks, 4 sessions, same time, same day, where someone comes in to make sense of the world with us. And Forrest has become a little bit of a celebrity at the Stoa. There's been many sort of like side book clubs that are emerging surrounding his work. So I'm very excited to have him here. He's been a guest twice already at the Stoa. And the title is a good one, Metaphysics, Philosophy, Civilization, Design, and Various High Arts. And our boy, Phil Chen, is going to be emceeing this series. So I'll tag him in a moment. And Phil's going to kind of set the frame, introduce Forrest, introduce the protocols, and then kind of like get a sense of what this series will be about. So that being said, I will tag in Phil right now.
All right. Well, my heart's beating really fast now. Getting a little nervous, but I'm super excited to have Forrest here today. And for the whole month. As Peter said, there's a lot of interest in his work, and I think it's well-founded. And also, I think Forrest is one of the people who people should really hear him more and hear his thoughts. There's a lot of interesting thoughts that hopefully can percolate out into the consciousness and really start moving the general world and civilization in a good direction. So to kick off, I'm going to give an intro to Forrest and then also provide the general framework and protocols for how this today is going to run. So I know that probably a lot of people have seen Forrest's couple of sessions on the Stoa, but for those who haven't, you may know him as the founder and CEO of Magic Flight, a company that was first introduced as the portable vaporizer in the world. But really Forrest is known as a philosopher, writer, researcher, scientist, a whole gambit of different things. And it's super lovely to have him here. He's thinking a lot about some long-range thinking topics that I think he's going to share with you today. So how today is going to run is specifically, I'll ask for some questions at the beginning, but this is really going to be an open Q&A. And so if you have a question that you would like to pose to Forrest, just put it in the chat box, mention that as a question. And if you don't want your question, if you don't want to say your question because this is being recorded, just indicate that in the chat and I will say it on your behalf. So that is the general protocols. I'm super excited to get this series started, and I'm going to start off by asking Forrest. Yeah, you have a lot on your mind these days. What are some topics that you would like to steer the Stoa for these next 4 sessions?
Well, there's a lot to work with. So I've been, I guess you could say one of the central things that I think about is communication process. So, a lot of people think about reason and how do we have, rational thinking about important choices? How do we work together? How do we communicate? How do we collaborate? And so I guess you could say that a lot of what I'm thinking about, particularly recently, is communication process in terms of just the dynamics, like how do we create good communication? And I know that a lot of this ground has probably been covered in facilitation theory and things like that, but I'm thinking about it more from the sense of how reason emerges from that. So I guess you could think that Habermas, for example, would be an exemplar of the kind of directions that I'm exploring. So obviously, I can answer questions about ephemeral group process or more generally about metaphysics or just, impressions or opinions about things. But it isn't so much that I wanted to just come with a whole presentation as much as I wanted to sort of look at, what people were interested in, what kind of topics might be really helpful in this space that people were also thinking about. Yeah, communication process and how that can go wrong, why it matters, how to think about community design, things along those lines as basically being the areas that I've been playing with recently.
Awesome. I think that's a good frame to start these chats. And for those of you who have questions, feel free to put them in the chat now. And for those who like questions, feel free to help me out in choosing questions by putting +1s, so I can have a better feel of the room and what's really resonating. But yeah, just to start off, I'm curious why you think communication and these different processes are important.
Well, there's two levels to it. One is obviously we have technology and machines that can help us to make decisions, and with artificial intelligence could potentially make decisions on our behalf. Although I think that we all know that in a lot of cases we want to make choices for ourselves, to basically have our own values be represented in modern economy process and things like that. So as part of the dynamic of how we show up as a species, how we show up as civilization, we can look at things that occur at the scale of individuals, and we can look at the things that occur at the scale of, say, nations or international stuff. We can look at the relationship between, humanity as a species and nature and ecosystems and things like that. But in all of this process of how we look at things, a lot of it comes down to how we collaborate. So for instance, when I'm basically trying to check, am I perceiving things well? Are the models that I'm using good? Do they make sense? Are there aspects of things, or are there ways of looking at stuff that are important that maybe I've overlooked? We tend to compare notes. We go and we visit our friends. We talk to people around us who are our colleagues, and we start to basically share, hey, this is what I think is important. These are the kinds of things which are concerning to me, or this is the kind of stuff that I'm noticing, and what do you think about that? And so in effect, what happens is that by comparing notes, we can begin to really perceive from multiple points of view. So for instance, if I sort of ask you a question and you answer it, then in effect, through your answer, I'm viewing the world a little bit through your own eyes. And so by essentially accounting for your perspective in conjunction with my own perspective, I can get insight into things. I can see in the same sort of way that we can see with two eyeballs, right? That the position by which we see each of these is a little different. And our brain can integrate that information to create a third dimension of perception, essentially a new field of information. So in this sense, our capacity to communicate is a large part of what makes us human, our capacity to coordinate and to collaborate and to join into larger groups and tribes and share skills and perceive from multiple perspectives and do this process we call sense making at this point is actually something which I guess from a species perspective is one of our superpowers. So in that particular sense, this is actually a very, very central, very, very important thing that we do as a culture that makes effectively civilization possible. So in that sense, considering that we're seeing with the internet and stuff like that, the emergence of whole new methodologies of communication and lots of new experiments being performed in that space, there's a lot of questions about, what are the principles that make communities form? How does communication process work in all of these different media? What implications does that have? And so in effect, there's a lot of different aspects, a lot of different directions to explore. So this is again just sort of a kind of snapshot of why I think communication is important. You can start to see its connections to so many other things.
All right, awesome. I think that's a good place to start. I wanted to start with Evan. Can you unmute and ask your question? And
Sure.
Thank for us to know he is part of the Imni Book Club.
Great.
Yeah, I've been unable to make it to the last few meetings, but I have read the book multiple times and really enjoyed it, and am getting a lot out of the discussions that we've been having on the STOA. So with that being said, my question for you is that I personally have found that there are certain very useful ways of looking at the world, which are very difficult to approach or communicate without a grounding in the combination of what I would call information theory 1 and 2, the practice of mysticism as broadly construed. Your eminent metaphysics seems to me to depend on a similar foundation. And so I'm curious if you think and have found this grounding is in fact essential to approach these topics and communicate them well, or if you think there might be other equally good ways into these topics that I have not considered. And just for some context around that question, because um, it's very difficult to communicate about some of these things when, for me at least, when people don't have that specific set of groundings, but I'm just one limited person, and so I'm interested in if there are other equally valid ways into the same material. So thank you.
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think you do have some real insight, which is that yes, there is a large component of information theory thinking that has worked into this, and although I don't mention it very much, I would also say that mysticism is actually pretty important. I guess you could say that science as a process, as a kind of rationality, as an epistemic method, is looking very much at the outside world, and in effect, to have equal skill at looking at the inside world, at looking at what is our mind, how does our consciousness work, what are the nature of our own biases and blind spots, what are the ways in which those can emerge into process biases at a sociological level. Now, again, I haven't, I'm not advocating, a particular tradition, but I think that, when people have studied very deeply in any one of a large number of Western or Eastern or third world religious perspectives, that there's really a lot of value and a lot of depth in terms of insight into ourselves and into the world around us. And that, to the more that we have become able to explore something like that deeply, the more profoundly that we have, really explored the questions of both science and technology and mathematics and spirituality, religion, and as you say, mysticism, the greater the richness of the languages with which we can speak and work, and the more easily that we can have conversations about things that matter. Particularly with the, I don't actually use the words religion, spirituality, and mysticism interchangeably. To me, they have actually very specific meanings. But without getting into all those details, I think that those three subjects in particular really encourage a kind of values-based orientation that allows us to appreciate the notion of meaningfulness in a much more profound way. So yeah, I definitely encourage that people, study one or another of the great traditions of the world. And again, I'm not entirely sure that it matters which, although I think some of them do have, different characters and depths that are worth exploring, that, may not be found in others. You might have to really explore something for like 5 or 10 years to get to the depth that would allow you to see other positions from within that. So in that particular respect, are there other approaches? Yeah, on one hand, there's lots of approaches. Do they involve the same sort of ingredients? Yes, they mostly do. I think that in my particular case, there is obviously a strong helping of science and mathematics and technology perspectives, and there's also a very strong helping of spirituality and religious and other perspectives, although again, most of that background wouldn't necessarily be very obvious or apparent.
Do you have a follow-up?
So a quick follow-up for you. Yeah, quick follow-up. So I actually just recently did a session on the Stoa this Saturday to explore a take on how to do some of this integration of the traditional views of rationality with the more traditionally mystical paths of phenomenological self-inquiry. And I'm just curious if you have any more specific suggestions or guidance, since this is a very alive topic for me, of which, if any, of those mystical paths of self-inquiry that you might be familiar with, or uh, might have the highest rate of return over time, meaning like would be the most efficient path for someone to be able to have a way into these insights, assuming that we have fixed, say, mathematics and information theory as one prerequisite. What might be some of the best introspective paths to explore as an adjunct to that?
Wow, that's actually I mean, it's a great question. Usually when trying to answer something like that, I would like to meet with you to learn more about what your personality is so that I can give that suggestion. Because again, a lot of these things, they have a very, they have very unique personalities. And so, you know, for my own perspective, I've found Sufism, for example, to be a very beautiful and a very deep and profound way of looking at things. Um, you know, so I obviously would think of that. Hinduism has a lot of beautiful things about it. I mean, there's actually, in fact, I'm a little reluctant to name anything in particular simply because there are so many beautiful things out there to explore. Um, you know, again, I come from a somewhat more Western perspective, so you know, I have my biases in that particular respect. But in terms of you know, which directions to go, there's actually a much wider variety of these things than is often apparent. And a lot of times you want to, I think the main thing that would be advice is that, you know, don't get hung up in the dogmaticism. It's not always about, you know, what is the strict liturgy or the rituals or the particular symbolisms as it is, you know, what are the narratives? What are the insights that come from the sort of stories and the kinds of mythological perspectives that they give? You know, and again, without going too far down that direction, you know, to really say, you know, how do you learn something like this? I can at least say that a lot of it is about personal inquiry. It's about finding one's own blind spots, being really willing to, you know, really look at oneself to really understand what is my personal relationship to myself, what is my personal relationship to nature, and what is my personal relationship to other. And you know, again, there's a lot that we can explore in that direction. But that's just in a general sense, those would be some indications.
Cool. I think this is somewhat a different reframe on this question that's getting a lot of upvotes in the chat. And Victor, this is Victor's question. You mentioned to me that I can ask it, and I might throw a little bit of a twist in. So along a similar veins, is there any like social context that you feel really have untapped potential to look at? And like, how do we unlock them? Or specifically, like, what is inspiring a lot of your work? Like, what communities, what different social contexts are you is really that you're super excited about?
Well, part of it wasn't just trying to identify existing social context, but just to try to say if we could create the perfect social context, what would that even look like? And I'm not speaking of some sort of utopian perspective, but just EGP, for example, is an experiment in creating a social context that allows for, you know, emergent process of a particularly insightful kind. I think that for my own part, the places that I'm most exploring is obviously collaboration. I'm particularly interested in what kinds of things facilitate good collaborative process and how that can be not necessarily scaled, but can emerge at larger community sizes. And so in effect, there's a lot of interest on my part in the kind of specifics of, you know, what kinds of agreements or agreement fields or what kind of context will create a really good collaborative process. And again, this is a very well-trodden path. I'm certainly not the first to have explored this. But in the sense of, you know, how it shows up in particular and the kinds of questions that I'm specifically looking at, I guess you could say it goes in the direction of really helping to notice the distinction between social influence process versus reflective inquiry process. So when we're looking at a broadcast kind of process, like, so for instance, in this moment, I'm speaking to a number of people. Um, Unfortunately, much as I would love to hear everybody's voice, just by the sheer numbers of people involved, I might not get a chance to. There is a real sense of you know, answering questions, right? So for instance, you know, there are questions that I ask myself, and when I'm asking myself a question, I'm in a process of reflective inquiry. I'm looking back. I'm looking, and it's an inquiry. It's like, you know, it's at the limits of my knowledge. It's at the places where I don't notice, and I'm usually looking for help. You know, what are other people's perspectives? How do they see, you know, not just myself as a kind of calibration, but also how they see the world, and really trying to find out things that we don't already know. But in a moment like this, obviously in this session, I'm going to be spending most of my time answering questions. So I can't really help but be, to some extent, in a a broadcast methodology in speaking, and I can't help but be, to some extent, influencing the social frame that we're in. So in one sense, there's that distinction. How do we notice when which of these is occurring? Because when you look at a lot of social process today in the world, there's a large number of contexts where the only thing that's happening is social influence. There really isn't any space for reflective inquiry. So just as a first cut, I'm much more interested in the places where reflective inquiry is actually what's happening, where sense making is actually what's the focus. So in that sense, the Stoa is attractive to me because obviously that's an area of interest here. The other piece that I think is kind of important when we're looking at social influence processes is that a lot of times it's very unclear as to who benefits from that process. In the modern world, particularly since the advent of cities and civilization. So in other words, I'm talking the last few thousand years. When I say recently, I'm thinking in kind of geological time. There's a real sense in which the sort of feedback mechanisms that would allow for people to effectively be quite, I wouldn't say selfish, but so self-oriented that it actually causes damage to the fabric of society. And to some extent, we need to have a much greater sense of awareness around how those kinds of things can happen and how we can build communities, even in the face of these evolutionary feedback mechanisms that have created that outcome. So again, these are some of the directions that I'm looking at, but particularly the transition from, discerning the difference between reflective inquiry, genuine reflective inquiry, and social influence. And then once inside the reflective inquiry process, what are the kinds of things that really allow for people to do perspective taking, to really understand one another's positions, to essentially be able to identify good faith process and things like that.
You mentioned the biological theory. Can you expand on that part a little bit?
Sure. So when I think of evolutionary process, this is actually an abstraction, and it's a pretty intense one actually. There's basically three fundamental dynamics to evolution. There's what we call mutation process. There's what we call selection, which effectively at this point means people get culled from the crowd, and then we have recombinatoric process, i.e., mate selection. And again, we can think about that in terms of individual species, but the dynamic itself is actually a very general one. There's ways to implement similar dynamics in software. It's called things like simulated annealing and stuff like that. The idea here is that when we are considering, tribal process, if a person was essentially operating in a way that wasn't consistent with the tribe would suffer very obviously from that. But they'd also know. The people that were in the tribe would be in enough coordination and communication on a day-to-day basis. They'd all know one another really, really well over a long and repeated time. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, it's very clear the case that there's a strong force that would, basically eject or punish defectors from the well-being of the tribe. But once you get towards city-state phenomena, where you have large numbers of people, where people don't know one another very well, where you don't necessarily have repeated transactions, then the game theory of it shifts a bit, and now all of a sudden you can effectively have people who are defecting against the well interests of the community and of the city or of the nation as a whole, and effectively through methods that we would normally identify as being very dishonest, promote themselves and effectively become not constrained by the situation. So in effect, the evolutionary pressure has shifted, and the kind of feedback mechanisms that would normally keep things like we would think of as dark triad phenomena from emerging, say, above a 0.5%, now can essentially do quite well at a 5% level. So that's a tenfold increase in the preponderance of what we would think of as being actually quite degenerate forms of social commerce. So in that particular sense, when we're thinking about civilization design, when we're thinking about things about how to do good governance and stuff like that, it becomes really, really important for us to know how to deal with that aspect and to essentially, put together methodologies that are much more resistant against corruption than the kinds of forms of government that we've currently seen.
Awesome. This is kind of going back a little bit, but there's a lot of interest in the chat about explicit question from Rob.
Hi, thanks, Forrest. This is tremendous. I was really curious when you mentioned that you're currently thinking a lot about how we could do communication better. And specifically when you said, how does communication go wrong? That sparked my curiosity. I was wondering if you could comment specifically on where are the biggest breakdowns of communication and maybe where are the subtlest breakdowns?
Wow. That's a broad field. There's a lot there, and I'm still exploring. So I don't know that I even have. I don't believe I have a good catalog yet. I think that that actually is something that is a very central interest to me right now. One of the things that I think goes wrong, and this isn't necessarily in order or even maybe the largest or the smallest. They're just things that I know about. Is not knowing the difference between discernment as a process and judgment as a process. So a lot of times, we engage in judgment type relationships with one another, and those effectively create a kind of cessation of communication. Whereas the discernment process is essentially a kind of a deepening or engagement process. So that distinction, I think, is an important difference, and one that's particularly important to develop as a skill. Another thing I think that goes wrong quite frequently is that communication is a kind of handshake between people. In order to create the handshake, and again, this goes into sort of a more mathematical theory, each party has to grant to the other three rights: the right to speak, the right to be understood, and the right to know that they have been understood. And the specificity of that is actually quite important. A lot of times people phrase it slightly differently, and there's some real nuances to this. So people will, obviously, in conversation, they will usually, although not always, grant each other the right to speak. And occasionally they will even grant the other person the right to be understood. But if you don't let them know that they have been understood, then the chances, because of the absence of the conference, they might say the same thing again, hoping to get the message across. And you see this same phenomena again occurring in protocol process, TCP, and in communication stacks at a digital level. For example, there's an acknowledgement that is required just to let you know the packet's arrived. And so in this particular sense, there's a real need for that handshake to occur, insofar as each person can only grant the rights to the other person. Nobody can demand anything, but when each party grants the three rights to the other, then the handshake is completed, and that closes the ring. At that point, it becomes possible for actual inquiry, reflective process to occur. So this is a really big one. We don't normally do a very good job of showing the other person that we've understood. Connected to this, and I think this is another one of these things. It's connected to a whole body of work called Theory U. Is that when we're trying to show someone else that we understand them, I mean, obviously there's the easy way, which is we can parrot back to them what we heard, or we could go a little farther and we could say something in our own language that shows them that we've internalized what they've said. But personally, I think that the best way to really show another person what they understood, or the kinds of stuff I look for, is what questions they ask next. So in effect, the idea here is that from the question, I can know where the front of their inquiry is. And so in effect, rather than trying to point at something in the center and say, I understand that, what I'm doing is I'm pointing at a couple of points on the periphery, and I can know that everything inside of that space is understood, because that's, they've shown me the boundary of where their knowledge is, and therefore I can know what's inside that boundary. And that's a far more powerful and comprehensive way of really articulating things that are understood and known and received, and really enables each party to help the other to advance the front of that knowledge. And of course, this goes back to the discernment judgment piece, which is really being very, very clear with what those questions are, really being in good faith that one is asking questions, i.e. looking at things from a reflective inquiry position rather than some sort of covert social influence thing, trying to get somebody to buy something or to vote a certain way or to, do something on their behalf or anything like that.
All right. Tyson, can you unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. My question is, Forrest, have you seen any unexpected, surprising group practices support consensus decision-making in groups? And or have you seen music making directly support choice making in groups? Have you seen music making used? Or what's the type of practices can support consensus in happening at some of those, when we're getting to the edge where consensus becomes very difficult? How have you seen interesting?
I'm going to answer the second question because I really like that question. Some of my best experiences, like just absolute peak experiences in life, have been playing music with other people. I think that has been, just absolutely. I could say things that are surprising to me, but the fact of that has been surprising to me, and still is in a certain way. I mean, it's like when so let me try to articulate a little bit about what my fascination is in this space and why I think this is such a great question. When a person goes into a drum circle, for example, so this is part of the places where I personally have some experience with this. I was part of a drum circle back in Amherst, Massachusetts for a while, and every month, a crew of fairly beautiful and skilled drummers would get together. My skill is somewhat at the middle level. I play clave reasonably well. I have a reasonably good sense of time, and I have a very discerning sense as to how people are playing with one another. So I actually liked the clave position because, in one sense, you can hear where different drummers are. So the whole point behind the clave and the june, which is essentially the lowest note and the highest, is to provide a context for the djembe players to really be able to just play well, to play really well, so that the dancers, the people that are in the community, can really dance to something that feels alive. And so in that particular sense, what you're doing with the clave is you're listening to where the different djembe players are, and you're helping them to align with one another. So, and it's very subtle, like a few milliseconds added here or there could pull one person into alignment with another, and they don't even know that this is happening. This is something you do as a kind of a service action, because the djembe players are themselves playing in service to the community. So in this particular sense, there's a kind of wordless communication. There's a non-linguistic interaction that's coordinating the group, the musicians group that is itself coordinating with the community of dancers. As I said, it's very beautiful. The point is that it's a non-linguistic process. It's a felt sense of communication without words. It's not in the mind per se, although you perceive it as you would perceive anything. But it's a way of creating a kind of consensus as to what is the right flow in that moment. And I recognize now that the opportunity of being part of that was a very precious thing. I'm sorry to get all emotional. It was really beautiful. I'm quite nostalgic about it. Anyways, try to hold myself together here. So yeah, I think that just the sheer fact of communication is not necessarily in words. It's not just in the ways in which we show up in a purely mental sense. And you'll notice that from the way I was describing this, that it isn't a ritual per se. I mean, it's music, and sometimes people may know various parts in very specific ways that they can play, so that particular piece comes alive. But a lot of them were just free jam sessions, where people would just basically make it up as they went, and they had enough skill to know how to play together. So there's a certain kind of allowance that's involved. There's a sense in which we're listening to one another, that we're genuinely, compassionately interested in helping each person to sort of sing their own voice and to sing their own note, and to do so in a combined way. I think that when we're looking at communication process with people, and again, going back to the linguistic sense, um, there was a technique that I experienced once, and again, this was something which was this is another person's work. But the idea is that that each person builds on the communication of the one before them. So, for instance, there's a tribal practice, for example, where you have everybody sort of line up in a circle in age, like the youngest, and then the next youngest, and then so on. So you have the oldest person, and each one basically speaks in turn of their age, and each builds on the thing that the one said before. It's not a contest. It's not a try to show who's right. It's not a debate. It's basically look, see, and tell the truth. And each person in the tribe, in the group, basically has a voice, and their voice is essentially, added to the insights of the voice in front of them, using the insights of the person speaking before to inform the insights that you have, so that your insights essentially were leveraged and elevated because you've essentially increased the capacity of the entire tribe to see in a new way. These are the kinds of things that I think are really exciting. And so when you're asking me about things that are surprising, it's the sometimes unexpected conjunction of techniques like this that can create results far out of proportion to the ingredients involved.
A lovely response. Thank you.
Follow-up, Tyler?
No follow-up. I just also have a resonance with some of my most nostalgic, precious moments happening, making music around a campfire. So that was a sweet moment. And the look, see, and tell the truth as a sort of mantra is something that I think will stick with me.
Yeah, likewise. And I know, Forrest, you can't read the chat. I mean, I got a little emotional as well, but there's definitely a couple of people here who also were tearing up, and a lot of support in the chat. Just want to let you know. Yeah, the next question is by Victor. I think he told me to, let me just find it. What are your thoughts on the role of ritual in social cohesion, sense making, and governance?
Ooh, well, I have a very nuanced opinion about that. Probably too nuanced to even try to convey in any easy way in this context. There's some things here I probably shouldn't even try to do. There's a lot of different meanings that people can bring to the word ritual. And partly my answer would depend very specifically on which meaning particularly people were thinking. In the most general sense, where we're not distinguishing between, say, ritual or ceremony or other celebratory processes that the communities can enter into. On one hand, I personally am a little allergic to rituals, but that's my own reaction, simply because I've been a part of a lot of them. I've been organizers in some cases and things like that, for community process. And I personally, I think I'm not much for the formality of it. I experience a tremendous amount of formality when I'm working with, obviously when I'm writing, and I'm also a software engineer, so code, for example, has a certain amount of required formality to it. And so when I come to the sort of human relational perspective, a lot of times what I'm really looking for is the ability to just sit with somebody and just actually be there, and not necessarily engage in some sort of specific process that is defined by a symbolism, which is a kind of overriding pattern. On the other hand, I can see that there are rituals that are very beautiful, and that there's a lot of cultural practices and narratives that explore, relationships in that space. For my own part, like I said, I'm more of a free roving intellect, and as a result, I tend to kind of want to find my own way rather than, at this point, engage too deeply in formal practices. So, there is that. I think I will also point out that my particular response to this isn't necessarily the thing I would recommend for other people to try to do. There are a lot of times where rituals have rationales that go well beyond the understanding of the group practicing it. Sometimes there's really good reasons why things are being done in a specific way, and they're not always obvious. You know, there's a kind of trust on my part that I, at this point, have explored things deeply enough that I can trust to know what those principles are. But on the other hand, that's a little bit of hubris on my part. But I have, let's just say at this particular point, I've explored some things deeply enough to feel confident to be able to do that, even though it would be one of those situations of, well, I might do this, but I wouldn't recommend other people try it the same way. I think for the large part, it's a good idea for people to understand the cultural practices and to really explore their depth as they are before trying to modify them too much.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of upvotes for Benita. I don't know if you have a specific question, but is there something you wanted to say to Forrest?
Yeah. So.
Benita Roy.
Yeah,
me.
So
good to see you. How are you?
I'm good. And you know, this is an extraordinary presentation. I feel like it's kind of got a zone, it's in the zone in a certain way. I want to go where the tears are, Forrest. Because I have the same, I suspect I have the same problem. You know, I always want to talk about horses and these experiences I have. And yet, in the general public, I'm always pulled toward more meta-systematic or conceptual territories. And, you know, I have a workshop on circus jazz, for example, as opening the mind to meditative states. And the tears are powerful, right? They show that there's something undone, I think, right, in our work. I don't know if I don't know, undone it, or what is the obstacle? Like what prevents more of that? What prevents amplifying that? It's a poorly formed question.
I think I have the sense of what you're saying. I'm exploring those questions too, and I don't know that I have. I'm very deeply interested and invested in answering those. I think that to some extent there's some contextual phenomena of a culture that's ready for it. I noticed that, you know, when I was on the East Coast in Western Massachusetts, that there were just some things that were just easier to do. And now that I'm here in California, in the San Diego area, there are other things that are just easier to do. So, you know, Magic Flight was mentioned earlier. That I actually feel that some of that work is among the very least of my accomplishments, or at least, you know, I'm proud of it. I'm proud of it for some really very specific things. But honestly, that business wouldn't have been possible anywhere else in the world. I mean, literally, I did an exercise to sort of examine that, and you know, it just was the right time, the right place with the right people, and it worked. It gelled. So there is some contextual magic to this. There's some kind of you know, synchronicity that's involved in that sort of way. And obviously, this isn't something that can be conditioned or controlled or created in any deliberate way, because as soon as we try to do that, we have too tight a grip. And so, you know, that's a big piece of it. And so, you know, my emotion earlier was partly the nostalgia of that, you know, to really have, you know, it isn't that I appreciated it at the time. I really did at the time. It was like probably the highlights of my whole month. My life at that time was actually quite challenging and quite difficult for a number of very specific reasons. Nonetheless, I think that, you know, in terms of more specifically, you're asking about what sort of things can we do to create and facilitate contexts like that. And I think that part of the thing I'm exploring is the discernment piece. how do I identify the places? What is it? What is actually present here that is a deepening enough that people can truly connect at the level of what matters? And I think part of that is a dynamic thing. If there was any formula or ritual or process that could, quote, make that happen, it would be far too easy for us to get into this social influence space, to manipulate it or to try to make it a thing or to try to shape it to what we expect it to be.
If I
But
could,
it's not about the
sorry.
form. It's about the feeling. It's, can we move into this space where we are sensitive and aware enough as to the actuality of what is here in the space of feeling, and through that create what is the thing that is right to be in this moment. I think that's the best answer I have for you at this moment.
Benny, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, but I have dogs howling at wolves. I want to highlight the distinction you made between judgment and discernment. I think that's a big deal, big skill. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
All right. Peter, you got a question?
Benita and I were talking recently about the stoa and what is it, and then the conclusion of that conversation was it's an experiment. It's like and there's like a feeling that, at least for me, it could be gone tomorrow, and then that's okay. And everything, including this session, is sort of an experiment. So my question to you is, what kind of experiments in conversation would you like to see at the stoa or similar spaces?
I'm not prepared to answer that question. I remember at one point I was asked something similar, just kind of indirectly through an email, and I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I basically, I feel that in order for me to answer a question like that, I would need to be a lot more involved. So my doing this sense maker in residence is partly a way for me to get more involved, so that I might actually be able to think of something in that space. But I'm a little cautious of coming in with recommendations that are like that specifically, simply because it's very, very easy for power hierarchies to emerge as a result. So for example, there becomes a kind of experimental program, and then you have a research scientist who's trying to figure out, a specific answer to a specific question. And then there's an agenda behind that. And then all of a sudden there's, people who are trying to jockey for position with respect to that agenda. And it just basically becomes very troublesome very quickly. The EGP process is something which was largely, an experiment on my part to explore an answer to that, to how to balance and prevent that sort of phenomena from occurring. But even in those cases, it was still somewhat troubling, because you still needed to essentially teach people how to ask good questions, or what it meant to observe what a good question was, and how to explore upgrades in the sense of going from, say, a what question, or rather a how question, to a why question, to a what question, without getting sort of stuck along the way. So there was a lot of coaching involved. There was a lot of process where we were essentially trying to develop embodiment techniques that would allow for the cultural transmission to occur without necessarily having a power cast form as a result. So there's a lot of really surprising, really subtle issues involved in putting together programs and designs. I think that the best I can do for you is to make a few recommendations, and these are exploratory to some extent. But one of the very specific things is that distributed process truly has to be distributed process, and that stabilizing that as distributed is actually far trickier and far more nuanced than it looks. So, spend some time thinking about what that means. For example, back in the 70s, there was a we will have no leaders perspective. And of course, what you would end up with is implied leadership structures that was covert, not overt, and that would become, actually more damaging to the community than just simply putting together something explicitly that wasn't against something, but was actually for something else. I think there's a lot of places where we haven't rightly accounted for basically the fullness of the human condition. We are, to put it quite frankly, we have marketplaces that we participate in, one of which is labor, another which could be thought of as creative works, and the last of which would be, basically what, for lack of a better word, is sort of the relational market, the sexual market. And these have very, very different dynamics associated with them. And so we're using one tool, communication, social process, to try to basically handle the interposition of all three of these at the same time. I guess if any of you have ever studied computer science, know the Linux philosophy, for example, there's this sort of observation that you want to use a tool to solve one problem at a time. You don't really have a thing that tries to be an omnibus Swiss Army knife, because it usually works very poorly. So you want to basically single purpose solutions, because that overall the constellation of tools working together gives you far more flexibility and ability to adapt than single platform type things could possibly do. So in this particular respect, we're using one language, we're using one tool, communicative process, to try to do three very different things. So clarity around that particular aspect is actually pretty important, because there's a kind of series of hidden assumptions underneath that that can be quite destabilizing if not handled. Just along those lines, just to give you a sense of what I mean, there's a community in Portugal called Tamara, and one of the charter things that they really do is they say, okay, well, we know the kinds of things that have caused communities to fail. Let's get really good at doing those things, and after that, everything else is going to be easier, because we did the hard stuff. I think when we're talking about community and experimental process and such like that, it's very, very easy to overlook that the hard stuff is actually hard. So in that particular sense, I'm a little reluctant to make a recommendation, because I'm still trying to grapple with the full depth of the issues that are involved. We don't get to change the human condition. We don't get to tell people what to do about certain things, and obviously we wouldn't want to. So how do we enable culture? How do we enable community? How do we enable really good communicative practice, and so on and so forth? These are perennial questions. They are a bit like asking, who am I? Why am I here? What is this all for? Except that now we're looking at it at a much broader level of, who are we? Why are we here? What is all this for? So on one hand, we could think of this as being a deeply metaphysical question, and through that, come to a much deeper set of insights than we would have if we were thinking it purely in a structural, functional way.
Any follow-up, Peter? No? All right. From a process point of view, we are hitting an hour, and I believe we have Forrest at least for 90 minutes. So there's at least another 30 minutes to go. And for all the people who have put questions really early on and still haven't asked it and want to still have it asked, I kind of lost a lot of the questions up top. So if you want to repost it, that'd be great. And yeah, so I'm going to ask a question that I believe was posed by Sam. So as a master woodworker, what is your take around craftsmanship and embodied skills in the future ahead?
I didn't quite hear that last part. I heard craftsmanship and embodied skills.
In the future ahead.
Okay.
What's your take on it?
That's actually a profound question. I think that when we look at the educational process in the world at large, we have the last 100 years particularly seen a very sort of top-down, almost militarized, regimented methodology of people sitting at desks and a lecturer standing at the front. Part of what it means to have become a craftsman is to have essentially explored a skill through a kind of apprenticeship process. And so in effect, there's a lived-in sense associated with the skill. It's not a relationship that's defined by just a particular time of day or a particular topic, as it is essentially a sort of constellation of experiences that, through the dynamic of that occurring in a longer term way, in a sort of recurring way, that a depth of insight and experience and embodiment is created that otherwise wouldn't exist. So I think that in a lot of ways, when we look at craftsmanship, we're actually looking at it as essentially a alternative model for education. And I'm not saying that the guild system is, perfect, or that it doesn't have any issues of its own, but it is genuinely a older, longer tradition and has solved certain problems which are actually relevant to the world today. The other piece that I think is important to recognize is that when we look at the nervous system and we appreciate these things, we call them hands. There is more neural signal coming to our brains from our hands than almost any other part of our body. The entire surface of the skin, minus a handful of areas, is not itself equal to that of one hand. And so in effect, when we're looking at not just the embodiment of knowledge with respect to a particular skill, but just literally the depth of capacity to think and to feel and to be is vastly increased just through the action of using one's hands in a way that is actually connected to the real world. Learning how to do pottery, or to work with clay, or to work with wood, or to be a stone carver, or to be a blacksmith, or to be any of these classical traditional traditions, isn't just for the sake of learning the skill of how to do blacksmithing, which today might not seem to be of much relevance, but to learn how metal flows, to learn how wood moves, to basically experience through your hands a greater sense of connection with the physical universe, and through that exposure to be able to become more conscious and more conscientious of how things actually work in spaces which are not necessarily negotiable. And there's a huge amount of subtlety to this. So for instance, when I was in the earlier days when I was running Magic Flight, I was teaching other people how to use tools, and some of them are power tools. And so for something like a table saw, for example, which actually is pretty dangerous. If you think about it, a wood shop, every person that goes into a wood shop and works there every day is risking their limbs. They're risking their fingers through, blades that are moving fast and machines that are far more powerful than any one of us as far as strength and speed is concerned. So in this particular sense, when you look at a person that's been a woodworker for a really long time, you look at their hands and you make sure they have all their fingers, because most people aren't that careful and they lose something. So there's a kind of conscientiousness that is how one's mind flows through the tool, through themselves, into the larger world. And so, for instance, if I was teaching somebody, I could literally watch them just walk up to the saw, and before they've even started the instrument, or just, even in the first few seconds in which they set up the cut, I can tell instantly whether they're competent and safe. And I would have no compulsion to basically interrupt at that point and basically say, no, you're not qualified to use this tool. So there's a sense here at which there's a kind of honesty in one's interaction with the physical universe that is unintermediated by any other person, unintermediated by any concepts of what it should be, but is essentially a direct engagement with what actually is. And this is a very, very different way of relating to the world than, say, is available through, say, high school popularity contests. It's very easy for political scenes to be decoupled from reality, because most of the people that are in them have never actually done anything with a physical enough level to have ever actually come to understand that there are some things which are true and are non-negotiable. They're not true because I said they were true. They're true because of the very nature of the being of self. They're very true of the nature of the being of the world. And so in effect, there's a sense here by which through craftsmanship, we begin to understand one another at a more deep level, and we begin to relate to one another in a sense that goes beyond just what our opinions are, but in a sense becomes an inquiry that includes more than just the relationship with other, that includes now self and world around us. And I think that to some extent that if we are going to make good choices about the world, if we're going to be aware of the environment in which we live and appropriate in our responsiveness to it, that to some extent having some actual background in one or another of these crafts is a strong enablement for that to actually be possible.
Awesome. I am told by Benita she has a segue on this question. A little mysterious. I don't know what the question is, but I'll pass it to Benita.
Yeah, so this is really exciting. So I've read your imminent metaphysics paper like 6 or 7 times.
I can apologize.
No, because I love it. And it's a poor substitution for being in dialogue with you. I want to say that. So what I'm about to say may actually be in concert where you're going, or it may be orthogonal. And this came up when I was watching Zach Stein's reinterpretation of your 3: omniscient, immanent, and transcendent. He has other words for it in these archetypal kind of realms he's dealing with. I don't know if you know how he's retranslating those. I don't remember his words or his terms. So the omniscient, I understand. The immanent, I understand. Although I have this process, philosophical way of looking at them in terms of what sublates what. And I think you understand those terms. But the transcendental, and this is why your conversation about woodworking brought me in. I asked Zach, I said, isn't the transcendental the action, the behavior? Because it's unknown, unpredictable, and the effects are lasting. It's way beyond us. So instead of thinking of the transcendental as hypermental or a view or an organizing principle, couldn't in fact the transcendental be the action that we take? Because in general, not in general, we act without knowing, we act with consequences we can't predict. To me, the action is the transcendental, and I see in your work like I see that's what you're saying, but you can't see it. I don't mean to be narcissistic, but that's what I think you're saying, Forrest. The action taken is transcendental, not imminent, but transcendental. So I asked Zach that, and he said, well, yes, but it's complicated. So I don't know. It's late in the day, but that's my question.
Let me put this together in a way. I'm agreeing with you, and I see the validity of your insight. One way to connect it back to the text itself, which isn't necessarily obvious in the text, but there's a relationship between these 3 modalities and choice, change, and causation. And you'll notice that the notion of choice is connected to the transcendental. So the action of choosing, as you very specifically said also, was that I can't predict your next choice. In fact, I don't even really have the capacity to predict in advance my next choice, because my choice can only be made at the time that I make it. But that the action of choice goes from something which is deep inside to something which is outside. It goes from the subjective to the objective, and it crosses this void of unknowing to do so. So in a sense, the way in which you are articulating the concept has a deeply creative element, a deeply connected back to a question that was asked earlier, a kind of mystic element. It's a sort of mysticism expressed. And that is on one hand, it is a deeply mysterious thing. It's an element that isn't necessarily obvious to perception. There's no way to make it something that can be defined in terms of structure or form, but it is accessible through feeling. It is accessible through one's participation in life through the creative act of choosing. And of course, when we ask, who is it that chooses? Then we move deeper into this direction of what is the transcendental. So, I think that your observations are on the right direction. There's some obviously there's some technicality that we can get into around the specific language and why these terms are bound a certain way. But at the other end of it, I think that where we end up is largely through an affirmation of your intuition.
Yeah, and that's what I saw in your work, like that's how it affected me. And we all read for confirmation bias. So like there's that little opinion, but as I get to know you more, it really, like, your work is extraordinary, and I just wanted to feed that back to you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Ryan, can you unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Forrest. This
Hello?
has been just so touching. I'm truly grateful that you're coming on here, and really been enjoying the fireworks that your imminent metaphysics has been setting off in my mind. I'm also reading Pierce right now, and sitting right next to me in college, I studied this. I don't know if you've read this. Yeah, Chittick. This is the Sufi path of knowledge, which is Ibn al-Arabi's metaphysics of Sufism, and its corresponding or conjugate is the Sufi path of love, which is Rumi's, which is a beautiful book. And so the question I asked in the chat was, if love is that which enables choice, how do we begin to enable greater love? And I think you've maybe already answered some of that with your question, with your just talking about woodworking and craft and hand and music. And if you don't care to go deeper into that specific question, I'm curious just how you might talk about the practice of remembrance. So in Sufism or in Islam, there's an idea of remembrance or zikr. And then when I think about the places that we get stuck is in building these constructive narratives. We tend to call them history. And then we objectify these, or we make them objective. So we have an objective narrative, but that's really a consensus objectivity. So basically, how do we build better narratives, or narratives that maybe engender or enable love as a part of a group process? So thanks.
I'm wanting to sit with that question a little bit so that I can sense some of the nuances of it. One of the flavors that I heard or that I've heard in the past that I'm reminded of when you were speaking, I think it was actually in Star Trek. This Klingon Worf gets asked by one of his students after he has just spent a bunch of time talking about a mythology. The kid asks, well, is it true? And he answers, each time I read it, I find great truths. And it's the reframe right there that is the thing that I think is I mean, that was just an incredibly beautiful moment. And the point here is that the narratives, we cannot help but experience the world in a narrative way. We cannot help but think in terms of narratives. So in effect, they become the vehicle through which we have perception, the vehicle through which we have knowing, and which we have remembering. But as you pointed out, the narratives themselves aren't, the map's not the territory. It's not about the narrative. It's actually about the things that it enables to become, the things that it enables to be possible. And even using the word things is kind of a misnomer here. I could expand it to try to say process, but there's, to go back to something Benita was pointing out, there's an element beyond process. There's a dynamic that is in some respects unknowable. So for instance, when we look at love and we think about, what are the kinds of things that enable love, I point out that in some of these places, more in this book called The Effective Choice, and also in some other books which I have not yet finished writing, that there's no conditionalization. There's no technique that I can use to compel anybody to love anything. There's no technique or methodology or practice that I can use to compel me to love anything, because it's not something which is subject to any kind of logic or pattern or causation. And that if it was, then it would be less than what it is. It is in the unreason of the love that it is meaningful. It is the fact of it being unconditional that makes it perfect. So in this sense, there is a real recognition that I'm not necessarily going to be able to create conditions that would be anything other than nurturing of what is already there. It would only be facilitating of the awareness that we may not yet have completely deepened to what it is that we already care about. The meaningfulness of life is intrinsic. It is already present. Occasionally I get jokers who think that they, having met a quote unquote great philosopher, is now going to ask a question which will stump him cold. What is the meaning of life? It's like, I hear that a lot. There's no meaningfulness that is not alive, and there is no aliveness that is not meaningful. So in this particular sense, when we are wanting to deepen our practice of love and of being loving, that we are in effect deepening our awareness of the meaningfulness and our knowledge of the meaningfulness of life. And it's not just our lives that we discover in that process, but those of the life that is around us, be they people or animals or places. In that particular sense, we do discover that we have actually created an increase in our capacity to love, but it wasn't because we did some technique. It was because we had become more discerning about what was already there.
I realized earlier I forgot to ask people if they want to follow up. But yeah, Ryan, do you want to follow up on that?
I can't tell you how much more this experience means to me than I thought it would. My work is, I work as a hospice nurse, and these things that you're saying right now are things that are present in that space as well. And this is just a really beautiful reminder of how to bring that with me as I'm in those places with those people. So thank you.
You're having told me that. Thank you for that sharing, because I can see that the connections between what I've just described and for people that are in that space, why that particularly would be important. Thank you for asking that question.
Awesome. I'm very curious. Tomer, I think I'm saying that right. Tomer, can you unmute and ask your question?
Hi guys, this is Tomer. I'm from Tel Aviv. It's 1:15 a.m. right now. I hope I'm not waking up my kids in me asking. And in any case, I want to just frame the context of my asking as I have a problem and I need help with my problem rather than I'm seeking the right sort of truthful answer to that question. And that is that once I have uninstalled in my software this idea of, facts independent of theories or conceptual language and this Leibniz idea, I mean, the wreckage is really immense, and I am in that sense not sure when I refer to logic as as canon and organon by Kant. So I definitely see that as the grammar of God, this is very wrong. As the grammar to anchor human practice, this can work. But then the reverse engineering part, the part where right? It's canon. The logic is canon. This part is entirely individual. It's the truth is only in continuation with a given self. So how do we know that we're not lost entirely when we're not replicating patterns that are not biological? And thereby I ask, how do we know that love is moral?
So I hear the question of how do we, in our own reflections on our own spiritual practices, not get caught in some sort of delusion?
Can we stop narcissism at bay? Possibly in any ever given.
So if I'm interpreting the question correctly, and I'm trying to be sure that I answer the thing that you're asking. Well, actually, I may be even presuming too much. It might even be beyond my scope to presume that I could answer a question such as that. But I know that for my own process, that it is when I can go beyond myself into nature. So you mentioned the biological connection. You mentioned the sort of embodiment connection, I do believe. And in that sense, it becomes the notion of where I am and the rest is, where, essentially that as we explore these things, the boundary of self becomes a variable. That in effect,
to become one with the circumstances. This part I get.
Yeah.
I love this, but I'm asking humanities as something which has other implications besides that.
Yes.
This part I need reconvincing why it's a worthy sort of endeavor.
Yes, exactly. No, I'm now getting, I think, actually the greater sense of your question, and it is a valid and important question. I think it's one that's actually been overlooked in a great number of traditions and ways of thinking of the world to date. One way that I have experienced this, and maybe this will make sense as a way of framing this. For example, we have things like the Bodhisattva vow, right, to try to help all the world to become enlightened, but it's still done at an individual level. It's still, in a sense, treated as individual consciousness going through an enlightenment process. And so in effect, there's a sense here at which, what does it mean for a community to go through enlightenment process? To not have it be something that is bound to within, a particular individual. So sure, maybe somebody becomes enlightened, but then what? They live their 80 or so years, and they may have said great and beautiful things and written books and so on and so forth. But what does it matter? Because eventually they pass, and although there may be future generations that are influenced by the beauty of all that, in what way has it gone beyond just self?
Correct.
And what way does it become something which is more than just something that one achieves as an individual in terms of connection to the divine? And so in this particular sense, I actually, the question is I think profoundly important. And it is something which, on one hand, I will admit that I have spent more than a little bit of time exploring and investigating. And a great deal of my hopes and dreams are tied to what it may become that is a response to that. I think that in a lot of ways that we are looking at community process and communication and how to think about making choices that are responsive to the world in the sense of X risk resolve and civilization design and long-term conscious sustainable evolution, partly because we're striving for a sense of response to this exact thing, that we become as a species more altruistic rather than just as individuals more altruistic. And that if we are truly to be the stewards of the natural world, if we're in a sense to there is a deeper calling. There is a response that nature itself is asking of us. And it isn't necessarily the thing that most people think, which is, you know, nature saying, hey, humanity, you're hurting me. And as long as we think of ourselves as being a manifestation of a problem, as being the problem, we will continue to be the problem. And when we realize ourselves as a solution to an even deeper need, then there is change. And these two questions are connected. You feel in yourself, as I do, that there is a sense in which it needs to go beyond just that which is individual process or monotheistic ways of thinking.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think there is a way by which you'd want to build Noah Ark by saying, we are the custodians of this place, and thereby, in a deep time perspective, our role is to, you know, preserve this miracle. And there is this continuity whereby we are playing a certain game right now, and what we need to, you know, get us off the tree in an organized fashion, right? And so continuity is an obligation to the current way of existence, right? And anyways, I need, something wants me to become utterly convinced that there's that we're not yet another Romans that are going to fail like every other culture before us, and la 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 and all that, right? I mean, that we can achieve some kind of ability to breathe with reality and remain kind of rational human. So I don't know. I mean, whatever you said makes good sense to me. Forrest, I think you're one of the most beautiful minds that are alive today. And I'm really grateful for all your work. And if anything along this ever becomes kind of, again, relevant, and I would, you know, save my further clarification question to a different time then, with your permission. Thank you.
Yeah, we are hitting the 90-minute mark. And there have been many questions that are still left unanswered. But the great news is Forrest is back next week and can answer much more. I'm feeling particularly called to allow, we talked a lot about love today, allow all of you to share your reflections and love to Forrest through the chat. And I'll save a chat and send that to him. He can say that as well, and I'm sure he'll likely read it. And while you guys are doing so, I'd love to give Forrest the final opportunity to share any final thoughts that you may have from this session.
Well, This has been a profoundly unexpected session for me. I had entered into this day, and my last few weeks have actually been quite troubling for me in a number of personal dimensions. So I entered into this space a little raw. And the questions that have been asked and the way in which this has been received has exceeded my expectations too. Not that I had that many expectations, but that it has by far exceeded any capacity that I would have anticipated it to have been. So in that particular sense, I am very glad for this. And I know that it has been a beautiful experience for myself, as well as I'm hoping for others. And in this particular sense, I've now set a standard for myself that I will have to live up to for the next 3 or so sessions. I make no promise that I will be able to do that, although I will strive hard. And in any case, I have been profoundly blessed to have been given this opportunity, and I'm super glad to have been here with you today. So with that, I guess that's my concluding remarks.
All right. Super appreciate you coming here. I'm still buzzed. I loved your vulnerability today. Yeah, and to close it out, I want to pass it back to Peter.
Wow. Yeah, I'm feeling super tender right now. Great first session for launching this series. So deepest love and gratitude to you, Forrest, for coming to the Stoa today. And thank you, Phil, for holding space the way you did. You did a great job. And everyone for the room today for just bringing beautiful questions and holding space collectively. So to talk about a couple of events coming up. Yeah, so this session is gonna same time next week. And then tomorrow we have Daniel Ingram, Hardcore Dharma at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then Forrest mentioned Theory U, Otto Scharmer. He's coming in on December 15th to discuss Theory U. That's at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So you can check that out on the website. Yeah, that being said, Forrest, Phil, everyone, thanks for coming to the store today.